Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Sean H. Williams, and this is the Campbellsville University Senior Seminar Discussion Forum. For those of you who may have been watching for the last few years, the Campbellsville University Senior Seminar hosts a roundtable discussion where we talk about current issues and events from the day from the perspective of political science. We've been doing this for several years, so if you enjoy this broadcast and you haven't seen our previous years, please be sure to check us out. Today, I'm being joined by a couple of our panelists, and we're going to be talking about a question that's been sort of on the tip of everybody's tongue in foreign policy circles. How is it that the Taliban have managed to stick around for 20 years and effectively take on the greatest military superpower in the world and win? After being removed from power in Afghanistan, they are back again and back in control. And our panelists today are going to be here to share some of their thoughts. Joining me, I have from top to bottom, Ms. Milan Bailey. Ms. Bailey, how are you doing this morning?
I'm good.
Very good. Glad to hear it. And Alyssa, formerly Davis. Alyssa, remind me what your current married name is.
Sorry, Wathen.
Wathen. I keep forgetting. I've known you for several years, and I keep forgetting what your married name is. Alyssa Wathen. Thank you for joining us. So today, as I said, we want to talk about the Taliban, and specifically want to talk about what has happened that has allowed the Taliban to go from being a defeated power that was literally forced in the mountains to becoming the government of Afghanistan once again. So for the viewers who may not have been paying attention for the last 20 years, who exactly are the Taliban and why are we talking about them?
So the Taliban originally were the previous form of government that the U.S. overthrew back in 2001. And yeah, they are back. And not just as a terrorist organization per se, but as a legitimate government, or at least they claim to be.
That's a great point that you mentioned. Do you think it's fair to call them a terrorist organization? Or do we really need to think of them as being a rebel group? Do we need to think about them because they were formerly a government and they became a government again? How do you guys think about the Taliban?
Personally, I wouldn't label them as a terrorist organization. I would absolutely define them as being a government that was overthrown and resurged. So if you want to label them anything, it might be freedom fighters, as odd as that sounds.
Ms. Bailey, what do you think? What's your perspective?
I mean, yeah, I agree. I don't think, we used to label them as terrorists, but as we've seen with the rise of them and what took place in August, I think it would be best to label them as maybe an insurgency or like a rebel group, like you said, an extremist rebel group.
I was going to say, I think the label of terrorism is very much skewed from not just American, but the Western lens. And when we define groups as being terroristic, we almost label this inhumanity to a group, where I think by illegitimizing it, you also don't give them the legitimacy they have earned. And by that, I don't mean that they are more legitimate per se, but that they are a force to be reckoned with, and not just as a big bad group, but as a political entity, right? Like you labeled things terrorists, groups terrorists, in hopes that it'll deter people from joining in, right, and agreeing with this side. And with the Taliban, we've seen that that's not necessarily true. A lot of Afghani people actually support the Taliban.
As we get started in our discussion, and based on your research, it feels like there is a difference of opinion, or maybe a debate about whether we should talk about being the Taliban as an organization that comes from strength in the way that you were just referring to it, Ms. Wathen, or if we should be thinking about somehow that what Afghanistan really is, it's about American failure. Is it that the Taliban are resilient, or is it that the Americans and the Afghani government have been incompetent. So Ms. Bailey, why don't you go ahead and get started? Which do you think is the more accurate description, that the Taliban has been effective or that the Americans and the Afghanis have been ineffective?
I think it would be more accurate to say that the Americans and Afghani government have been ineffective. I think it started, like, you can look back in 2013 when President George W. Bush, he made the decision to invade Iraq. I think ever since then, Afghanistan was kind of put on the back burner, unfortunately, and that just caused things to only escalate. Yeah.
Ms. Wathen, do you have the same opinion?
Similar, yeah. I would say that there's a couple of competing reasons for why the Taliban have been so resilient. I think on the one hand, yeah, I think American and international aid has really dropped the ball, not necessarily in lack of aid, but in lack of understanding of the area that they're in and what the people of the area needed in terms of ethnic diversity and problems within ethnic groups, and trying to just blanket govern a very large and diverse group without really fully understanding what it is that we were getting into. And because of that, it allowed the Taliban the support of those who disagreed with the US that maybe wouldn't have normally sided with the Taliban.
Is that a fault of the American government and the international community, or is that a fault of the Afghani government that basically was in charge of Afghanistan? I mean, I guess
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I guess my point is, we shouldn't necessarily expect for a European power who wanted to give help to the United States to understand the complexities of America. Why would we expect the international community to understand Afghanistan better than the Afghani government does?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is a fault of the Afghani government. We did place the leaders, the initial leaders in place, and in doing so, we probably should have been a little bit more careful with choosing, just because we didn't understand. Like I said, those ethnic diversity, but ultimately, I do think it falls more on the Afghani government as far as lack of understanding and care being taken. I do think that the Americans are still at fault, though, in some sense, because we should have picked up on this a long time ago. We've been working directly with the government, with the Afghani government, for long enough that we should have been able to pick up on this corruption and all of these different aspects of Afghani life that were falling through the cracks that we just didn't pay attention to.
Yeah, I agree. And I think with some of that, some things were picked up on, they were just ignored. Like a lot of things dealing with corruption were just kind of put to the side or seen as not, maybe not as big of a deal as some other issues. So America did kind of let that slip through the cracks.
I mean, we funded them dramatic. I mean, the amount of money funneled into Afghanistan by the US is astonishing. And for as much of it to go through corrupt government and not be utilized for, actual Afghani aid it's disappointing, to say the least. And I think the Afghani government is absolutely at fault, but also the US is at fault for continuously supplying more and more money to a corrupt government that we knew was corrupt.
So you guys, you've used a couple of different concepts to maybe explore these a little bit, whichever order that you want to. You've been talking about aid that the American government has been providing. And so it might be helpful to the viewers to think through what kinds of aid and what kinds of assistance they've been providing. So I guess let's start there. What sorts of assistance have the international community, the United States in particular, been giving to the Afghanis? Ms. Bailey.
Well, the main thing, well, I wouldn't say the main thing, but a big thing is, of course, military support, providing them with like the means for drones and airstrikes, And unfortunately, with the military support, a lot of that kind of went sideways, and a lot of civilian casualties occurred, which only made civilians distrust the American government and the Afghani government even more, because it was like, okay, you're only like, the effects of this are causing us to hurt. It's killing women and children more than it might be affecting the Taliban.
Was that a strategy of the Taliban to try to incur civilian casualties, or was that again a failure of the United States government or the Afghani government to take the appropriate steps to protect civilians?
I would argue that it's probably a little bit of both. I think the Taliban have absolutely utilized the countryside as a fighting arena, partly because it is more difficult to fight on, but also to ensure that more civilian casualties would come up with misfires, right? But at the same time, I do think that the US is also responsible for any and all deaths that occur. I mean, we should know where our bombs are landing, and if we don't, that's a problem.
But if as a insurgent organization or a terrorist organization, if you use positions that are in neighborhoods, or if you use positions in which there are non-combatants around, is it better for a military to just simply allow them to operate out of these areas? Or is the military going to have to accept the fact that, if the civilian population is going to allow these organizations to operate, that these civilians are going to have to understand there's a potential, at least, for collateral damage?
I would say that while, yes, I agree to a degree, I think there's different ways to go about it. And I think, so I forget the exact statistic, but I looked it up. Milan looked it up because it was in her paper. It was like 40% of casualties, of civilian casualties were between 2016 and 2020. And during that time, we were just bombing the ever-loving the poop out of Afghanistan. We were pulling troops and we were bombing. There's other ways to go about getting insurgent groups out of neighborhoods and out of areas than just bombing. And we've seen that because we did it. We did it in 2001 and it worked. The problem is that they regrouped. And when they did, we didn't take the necessary action within the government, like within supporting the leaders of Afghanistan. And the Afghani government really dropped the ball on formulating an actual governmental system that would work with the people and that would gain support of the people.
Is that because of a lack of legitimacy, or is it because you all talked about the term corruption a few times? I guess maybe we should start off with corruption. What sorts of corruption did you guys find in your research that were particularly problematic in Afghanistan?
Well, the biggest source of corruption actually came from the judicial government. There was a survey done by the Integrity Watch Afghanistan, and it was basically just taken among civilians in Afghanistan, and they agreed pretty much simultaneously that the biggest section of corruption came from the judicial branch. There were lots of bribing to get people excused, just all sorts of stuff like that.
Absolutely. And I think there was also a lot of corruption. From what I found, there was a lot of corruption within government officials taking advantage of aid and like utilizing it for personal gain. And even in drug cartels, there was money being funneled into heroin. And that's, as a civilian, how can you trust a government that's supporting systems that are against not only what you believe, but are actively harming your community. I mean, through not only, heroin and drug abuse, but also neglect. I mean, just pure neglect of the civilians. I think in my paper, I referenced a article about how in Kabul, there were literally beautiful, wonderful hotels that were extravagant and gorgeous, and peasants are on the street right nearby, literally living in their own poop. Like the sanitation crisis is astronomical, and the lack of infrastructure that the Afghani government utilized, I think is very indicative of the level of corruption in the area.
So that might explain why the Taliban, or excuse me, that might explain why the Afghani people never warmed up to the Afghan government. But how does that then translate to the Taliban being able to effectively maintain control over territory and then recapture the country? I mean, is it necessarily the case that because the Afghani government doesn't work, that the Taliban are going to be the ones that have to win?
I think that the Taliban were one of the more formidable forces that ensured and encouraged a judicial system, right? Like, they were very adamant from the get-go. Number one, they'd already been in as a governmental structure. And so people already knew of them, knew what they were about, and knew that while they may not have agreed with the way things worked, they did work, right? Like, the level of corruption was not quite as severe as it is in the I guess now previous Afghani government, but yeah.
Ms. Bailey, what do you think?
In a lot of the situations that we've talked about, it's where the Afghani government has dropped the ball, the Taliban picks it up and runs with it. Like, you could talk about drugs in Afghanistan. The Afghanistan government didn't handle that very well, but then the Taliban came in and took measures into their own hands and seemed to do it better, at least in the eyes of civilians, than the Afghani government.
Not to mention, there's also that idea, right, of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? I think a lot of people, because there were, I think, a lot of people who agreed with the Taliban, who saw the Taliban as a cohesive group that could support a proper judiciary system. But also, I think there's a lot of people who just hated America at that point. Like, they blamed America, they blamed the U.S., they blamed international involvement. And at that point, it becomes, I don't even care who is in charge as long as it's not these guys.
Talking about the problems in the judicial system or the corruption in the judicial system, one of the things that we hear a lot now that Afghanistan is back in the news is a discussion particularly of the Taliban legal system, which is based upon Sharia law. Sharia law sounds pretty draconian to the average American or to the typical Westerner. Why would the Afghani people accept something like a Sharia law from the Taliban? Is it just simply that it's better than nothing? It's better than the corrupt Afghani system? Or is there something within Sharia law and the Taliban legal code that native Afghanis actually prefer? Ms. Bailey, what do you think?
I think a big part of it could be that Sharia law is derived from the Quran, which, many people across the Middle East and Afghanistan seem to follow. So it has that sense of legitimacy. Sharia law does.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note that Sharia law in various forms, right? Sharia law, as the Taliban interpreted, was one thing, but Sharia law is interpreted differently all across the world, but it exists in most Muslim communities. And because of that, it becomes a very easy way to draw people together. Like we've said, there's this very diverse ethnic group in Afghanistan. And one of the few things that links all of those people together is religion. And while their opinions on what levels of Sharia law may be necessary are varying, there's a general agreement that Sharia law is good.
Yeah, I think also it's hard for democracy and Sharia law to exist together. So when democracy wasn't working for the Afghani government, the citizens of Afghanistan were like, okay, we'll try Sharia law. Like maybe this will work out for us.
Well, and it worked out before, right? Like, now, not necessarily for everyone involved, but it was a system, right? It was a system that functioned before.
At the very least, one of the things that you need from a legal code is an understanding or an expectation of how decisions are going to be made on the part of the people. And if I know what the outcome is going to be, maybe that's better than having a corrupt outcome or an unexpected outcome. One of the things that we should probably mention or discuss the Taliban as we're talking about the resilience is the support for the Taliban uniform across Afghani society? Or is it better thought of as being something that's regional? Is it something that is ethnic? Were they able to draw their support from these kind of cultural differences that you guys keep talking about?
I think some of it you could draw back to ethnicity. The Pashtuns are the biggest ethnicity in Afghanistan, and many of them are in the Taliban. Like most of the people in the Taliban belong to the Pashtun ethnicity group. So I think, and there's already the division between Pashtuns and non-Pashtuns. So I think it's easy for, especially Pashtuns being the largest ethnicity group, to want to like go towards the Taliban, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
So even if they don't necessarily agree with everything the Taliban does, they're still better off than if control is somewhere else.
Yeah.
In the region. Y'all had mentioned that, I think Ms. Wathan, you had mentioned earlier that Sharia law is different in different places. One of the questions that keeps coming up in Western discourse is whether Afghanistan should expect to have the same level or type of Sharia law that it did 20 years ago whenever the Taliban were in control, or if maybe there might be a kinder, gentler version of the Taliban that's come back in the next 20 years. Do you feel like this is important in understanding whether or not the Taliban will be considered legitimate? Or do you feel that the Taliban have enough strength now that even if they went back to the older Sharian rules of 20 years ago, rather than a more moderate version that maybe some have discussed, that they'll still be able to maintain control of the country? What do you think?
I would say that a couple of things. I think number one, it's important to remember that we've occupied Afghanistan now for 20 years. And that is a long time to live with Western social conduct, right? And not all areas have, but especially in larger cities, that has absolutely been the case. And so I think it's not so much a question of whether or not the Taliban expect to be legitimized by outside governments, by international governments, but rather whether or not they're going to create a more moderate Sharia law than what they had before because of the people living within Afghanistan now. I mean, I think people have changed over the last 20 years, not maybe as dramatically as we'd like to think that we've instilled in people over here. But I do believe that absolutely the Taliban is thinking at least of enforcing a more moderate form of Sharia law than we saw 20 years ago.
Ms. Bailey, do you agree with that assessment?
Yes, I agree.
So given that, do you think that the Taliban has a chance of survival? Do you think that they'll be able to maintain control of Afghanistan or and stabilize the region? Or do you think that the region is going to remain kind of politically or militarily unstable going forward?
I would sorry, go on ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I would say it's hard to say. It's hard to say, right? Because on the one hand, I think the Taliban could, but I think in order to, they would have to adapt. And maybe they are, like we said, becoming more moderate, and maybe that adaptation would help in some areas. But overall, I think that the idea of a incredibly stable Afghan system all across the board of Afghanistan is a really difficult concept in and of itself, because the area, like we said before, is so diverse.
Ms. Bailey, what do you think?
I agree with what she said. Like, I think moving forward, it will be difficult for the Taliban, but I don't see a reason why they couldn't do that.
Yeah, I think either they'll adapt and find new ways of meeting everyone's expectations, all of these different ethnic groups, or they'll fizzle out, and only time will tell.
I think even if they don't find like new ways of meeting everyone's expectations, kind of think they'll be able to create their own. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, the best way to meet expectations is to establish expectations that are achievable. Another thing that has been part of a lot of the popular debate is the question of whether or not the Taliban will be able to remain successful without somehow participating with or engaging in the international community. And this debate has focused on, I guess, the key players in the region. First of all, what the Taliban's relationship with the United States might be like. And secondly, what the Taliban's relationship, probably mostly with China, but with China and Russia, might look like. Based upon what you've seen, based on what you read going forward, let's take them in order. What do you think that the American-Afghanistan relationship is going to be over the next 5 or 10 years? Do you think that we'll be able to establish some kind of a working relationship with them? Or do you see it becoming something more like our relationship with Cuba, which became anti-American after being occupied by this for a while, or Iran, which became anti-American after having a regime that was supported by us for a while? How do you think this will probably go down?
Honestly, I think it's kind of hard to say. I think there will be a lot of negotiating from the United States government trying to negotiate with the Taliban. Yeah, in 10 years' time, it's hard to say if the relationship will be more strained or if it will just keep being like trying to negotiate things.
Yeah, I think personally, I don't think that the relations between the US and the Taliban are going to be incredibly friendly for if not for a very long time, then at least for a while. Because I mean, there's still a lot of tension there, and the Taliban do not like us. So there may be some level of negotiations. I'm positive of that, but I think that as far as being on friendly terms, a friendly relationship with Afghanistan, it'll probably take some time.
And what do you think about the relations with other countries in the region? Do you think that China and Russia will be able to warm up to the Afghanis? Or do you see Afghanistan as being a potential threat or rival to the great powers in the region?
I wouldn't think that they would be a great threat, simply because with any kind of new regime, right, there's always a lot of instability. And I think that it's going to take the Taliban a while to even just take control of the country as a governing body, right? Like they've taken over the country, but they haven't yet put in place their new laws and their new regulations and their new government. And so it's going to take a little while, I think, for them to be seen on the world stage. And if we do see them, I think it will be possibly in alliance with other areas in the region like China or Russia.
I kind of disagree with that. I think that I totally blanked out. Gosh, what was I about to say? Oh, I think that the Taliban could be seen as competition for China and maybe possibly even Russia. The way that they go about things is, of course, violent, and I think that helps them in a lot of ways to get what they want, and to achieve their goals. And Alyssa kind of said that their laws haven't really been put into place, but I think that's not true. I think with Sharia law, we're already seeing the effects of that, them causing or making women wear the burqas and stuff like that, already making rules about women going to school. I think it's just going to continue to escalate.
That's fair.
Well, that is going to have to be the final word on our discussion on Taliban and Taliban resistance. For those of you who have joined us live, I greatly appreciate your attention. And for any of those of you who have found us and are watching us after the broadcast, again, also thank you for joining us. We will be providing 5 of our roundtable discussions over the course of the semester, about 1 every 3 weeks. So if you are free in about 3 weeks, please tune in and join us. We'll be discussing the coronavirus, and specifically, we'll be discussing questions of civil liberties and civil rights as they relate to the ability of government to limit access to public spaces, and how the government's been wrestling not just with coronavirus over the entire pandemic, but specifically with recent mandates that have been imposed as a result of the Delta variant, and discussions about whether or not people who have been vaccinated should be granted access to public spaces while those who are unvaccinated should not. So again, thank you for joining us, and God bless.